My best friend found the letter I never wanted him to read. What could change the moment those words become real? Could one unexpected discovery reveal something impossible to take back? Hi everyone, and welcome to the channel. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about friendship, hidden emotions, and life-changing moments, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for spending your time with us and for supporting this growing community with every view, comment, and share. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if your closest friend found a letter you never meant them to read, what would you hope they understood first? Now, settle in as this story begins with a single letter, an unexpected discovery, and a friendship standing quietly at the edge of change. Some secrets don't ruin your life the day you write them. They ruin it the day someone else reads them. The smell of fresh-cut oak usually settled my nerves, but not that Tuesday morning. It drifted through my workshop in slow, familiar waves, mixing with sawdust that floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight. Every shelf looked exactly where I had left it. Every tool rested in its place. Every unfinished chair waited patiently for my hands. Everything felt normal except for one impossible detail. The small cedar box was gone. I stopped in the middle of sanding a tabletop, blinking as though it might suddenly reappear if I gave reality another chance. No, the empty space on the top shelf stared back at me like a missing tooth. My heartbeat stumbled. I climbed onto the workbench anyway, searching behind paint cans, under old blueprints, even inside cabinets that were far too small to hold it. Nothing. Come on, I whispered, rubbing both hands over my face. This isn't funny. No one answered except the ceiling fan clicking overhead in its lazy rhythm. That box had never left the workshop. Not once. I built it myself 6 years ago from reclaimed cedar after an old customer insisted every meaningful thing deserved a home. I laughed when he said it. Then I secretly believed him. Inside the box sat one folded letter. Just one. No photographs. No keepsakes. No souvenirs from childhood. Just several pages I had written 3 years earlier after staying awake until nearly 4 in the morning because pretending had finally become more exhausting than loving someone in silence. I never mailed it. I never signed it where anyone could see. I never even admitted it existed. The letter wasn't written for courage. It was written because I had run out of places to hide my feelings. Grant Holloway never knew. At least I prayed he never knew. We had spent nearly a decade becoming the kind of friends everyone else quietly envied. Weekend road trips without destinations. Thanksgiving dinners when one of us couldn't make it home. Countless phone calls that started with 5-minute questions and somehow lasted until midnight. He documented mountains through his camera lens. I rebuilt forgotten furniture with my hands. Different careers. Different schedules. Somehow always the same orbit. Friends asked why neither of us was dating anyone seriously. We laughed it off. Grant blamed his travel calendar. I blamed long workdays. The truth sat folded inside that cedar box every single morning. My phone buzzed across the workbench, rattling beside a measuring tape. I almost ignored it. Then Grant's name appeared across the screen. My stomach dropped before I even opened the message. It was only 7 words. I found something in your workshop. My fingers went cold. I didn't ask what he had found. I already knew. 3 little dots appeared beneath his message, vanished, then returned again. Finally, another text arrived. We need to talk tonight. The rest of the day slipped past like wet paint that refused to dry. I answered customer calls without remembering a single conversation. I measured the same cabinet door 3 different times and somehow wrote down 3 different numbers. By lunchtime, I had given up pretending I could work. My eyes kept drifting toward the empty space where the cedar box had lived for years, and every glance felt like pressing on a bruise. Grant had been inside this workshop hundreds of times. He knew where I kept extra sandpaper, where I hid the decent coffee, and which drawer always jammed unless you lifted the handle first. He had never searched through my things before. He never needed to. We trusted each other in that quiet, comfortable way that only grows after years of showing up. That was what made the missing box feel even stranger. My mind wandered backward without permission. 10 years earlier, I had met Grant during freshman orientation after someone accidentally handed him my campus map. He looked at it, looked at me, and laughed because neither of us had any idea where the engineering building was. We spent the next hour getting completely lost together. By the end of the week, we knew every shortcut across campus except the ones we actually needed. Friendship arrived without an announcement. One shared pizza turned into study sessions. Study sessions became weekend hikes. Hikes became road trips with no destination beyond whatever town looked interesting on the highway exit signs. Somewhere along the way, he became the first person I wanted to call whenever something good happened, and the only person I wanted nearby whenever life fell apart. People noticed long before we did. My mother once smiled over Thanksgiving dinner and casually asked whether Grant planned to stay for dessert or forever. He nearly choked on his mashed potatoes while I laughed so hard I spilled iced tea across the table. We treated every joke the same way. Smile. Deflect. Change the subject. It seemed easier than asking why those comments lingered in my thoughts long after everyone else forgot them. 3 years ago, everything shifted during one ordinary Friday night. Grant had just landed his biggest photography contract and celebrated by bringing takeout to the workshop. We ate on overturned buckets because I still had not built proper chairs for the break area. He talked for nearly an hour about mountain ranges in Montana and sunrise lighting while I pretended my attention stayed on the conversation instead of the way his excitement lit up every sentence. After he left, the silence felt unusually loud. I sat at my workbench, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and started writing words I never expected another person to read. Every sentence became another confession I could not speak aloud. When dawn finally arrived, I folded the pages, placed them inside the cedar box, locked the tiny brass clasp, and convinced myself that hiding the truth counted as moving on. My phone remained silent all afternoon until just after 5:30. Another message appeared from Grant. No explanation. No apology. Only one sentence. I will stop by after sunset. I stared at those words until the screen went dark, wondering whether 10 years of friendship could survive a conversation neither of us had ever been brave enough to begin. The headlights swept across the front windows just as the last streak of orange disappeared beyond the trees. My stomach tightened before I even heard the truck door close. Grant always parked in the exact same spot beside the workshop, close enough to avoid the puddles after rain, far enough away that he would not block customers in the morning. Funny how the smallest habits could feel comforting one day and terrifying the next. I wiped my hands on an old shop towel for what had to be the 10th time, even though there was no sawdust left to remove. The door opened with its familiar chime. Grant stepped inside, carrying the cedar box in one hand. He wore a faded green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and hiking boots still dusted with dried dirt from his latest assignment. He looked exactly like himself, which somehow made everything worse. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but his eyes lingered on me a second longer than usual. Neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, thin and fragile like old glass. Finally, he crossed the room and placed the cedar box gently on my workbench. He did not slide it toward me. He simply let it rest there. "You left this open," he said quietly. My throat felt dry. I did not realize it was missing. It was the weakest sentence I had spoken in years. Grant nodded once, looking around the workshop instead of directly at me. "I came by yesterday while you were delivering that dining table. You told me I could borrow the clamp set whenever I needed it." I remembered. I had told him that dozens of times. He had probably walked in without thinking, reached toward the shelf, bumped the cedar box, and discovered what I had spent years hiding. Neither of us mentioned the letter. Instead, he wandered toward the rocking chair I had been restoring for an elderly customer. He ran his fingertips lightly across the smooth oak armrest. "You finished it," he said. "Almost." My answer sounded distant even to me. He smiled faintly. "You always say almost." I wanted to laugh. I wanted everything to return to the version of life that had existed yesterday morning. Instead, I watched the space between us grow heavier with every passing second. Grant turned back toward me. "How long have you been working on this chair?" "About 3 months." He nodded again. Long projects require patience. There was something hidden beneath those words, but I could not tell whether it was kindness or disappointment. My pulse hammered inside my ears. "Ask him. Just ask if he read it." "End this." My mouth refused to cooperate. Grant looked toward the windows where the evening had settled into deep blue shadows. "Have you ever regretted not saying something?" The question landed softly, yet it stole every bit of air from the room. I stared at him, searching his face for an answer that would rescue me from my own fear. There was none, only quiet curiosity and an emotion I could not quite name. I lowered my eyes to the worn wooden floor and gave the only honest reply I had. Every single day. Grant did not answer. He rested one hand on the cedar box for a brief moment, almost as though it carried more weight than its size could possibly hold. Then he turned toward the door. The little brass bell chimed again as he stepped outside. I stood frozen in the fading light, realizing that sometimes the hardest conversation was not the one people had. It was the one they walked away from without finishing. Morning arrived with the quiet confidence that everything should feel normal again. It did not. The workshop opened at 8. Customers wandered in with scratched tables and loose cabinet doors, and I smiled exactly when I was supposed to. My hands remembered every measurement, every cut, every careful pass of sandpaper. My mind remembered only the look in Grant's eyes before he walked away. I checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit. Nothing. Around noon, I almost sent him a message asking if he wanted to grab lunch like we had done every other Wednesday for years. My thumb hovered over his name until the screen dimmed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without typing a single word. Maybe he needed space. Maybe I had already lost something that could never be repaired. The days that followed settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. Grant stopped dropping by the workshop after photography assignments. The old camping mug he usually left beside my coffee maker stayed untouched on the shelf. Saturday mornings passed without his truck pulling into the parking lot. Even our group messages with mutual friends became strangely brief whenever both of us were included. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No accusation. Just the slow disappearance of ordinary moments that had quietly held our friendship together for years. It turned out silence could be louder than shouting. Every corner of town seemed determined to remind me of him. The diner where we always ordered pancakes after sunrise hikes. The hardware store employee who still asked whether my photographer friend was traveling again. The city park where Grant once convinced me to help rescue an abandoned kite from the top of an oak tree because, according to him, every good story deserved a ridiculous chapter. I laughed about that memory while standing in line for groceries, then realized I was the only person smiling. One rainy afternoon, I found myself unlocking the cedar box again. The folded pages waited exactly where I had left them after Grant returned it. I traced the edge of the paper with one finger, but never unfolded it. I already knew every sentence by heart. Reading them again would not change anything. Outside, rain tapped softly against the workshop windows, each drop sounding like another unanswered question. Late Friday evening, my sister called to check on me. She listened quietly while I insisted work was busy and everything was fine. She let the silence linger before saying, "You know, people who are angry usually make noise. People who are confused often disappear." After we hung up, those words echoed through the empty workshop long after the call ended. Confused. Was that what Grant was feeling? Or was I simply inventing hope because the alternative hurt too much to face? Another week slipped by. Autumn settled deeper across town, covering sidewalks with bright maple leaves that crackled beneath my boots each morning. I caught myself looking toward the parking lot every time an unfamiliar truck slowed near the building. It was never him. Then, just as I accepted that distance had become our new normal, my phone vibrated during closing time. The message was short enough to fit on a single line. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was only a calendar reminder that had been scheduled months before. Do not forget. Cabin trip next Friday. I stared at the screen for a long time, remembering the annual photography weekend we had planned before everything changed. Neither of us had canceled it. Neither of us had mentioned it. Somehow, despite all the silence between us, that promise was still waiting. Grant had always believed photographs captured moments that words could never hold. Ironically, it was a handful of handwritten pages that left him unable to look through his camera for nearly 2 weeks. The first time he unfolded the letter inside the workshop, he had only meant to make sure it was not an invoice or a customer order that had slipped into the cedar box by mistake. He read the opening sentence, then another, then another. By the time he reached the final page, the afternoon sunlight had shifted across the floor, and he had not noticed a single minute passing. He folded the pages with trembling care, placed them exactly as he had found them, and sat alone on an old stool staring at the opposite wall. Nothing inside the letter frightened him. That was the problem. It felt painfully familiar. Every confession Nolan had hidden for years sounded strangely close to thoughts Grant himself had buried even deeper. He remembered the first camping trip after college when they had shared coffee before sunrise beside a quiet lake. Nolan had laughed because Grant insisted the sunrise looked different through every camera lens. Grant had almost reached for his hand that morning without thinking. Instead, he wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and pretended the cold air was the reason. There had been dozens of moments like that. Movie nights where the couch suddenly felt too small. Long drives where comfortable silence somehow carried more meaning than conversation. Airport reunions after photography assignments where seeing Nolan waiting by baggage claim always felt suspiciously like coming home. Grant had dismissed every feeling with the same excuse. Nolan was kind to everyone. Nolan trusted him because they were best friends. Crossing that invisible line could destroy the one relationship he valued more than anything else. Then the letter appeared and quietly erased every explanation he had spent years believing. So why had he stayed away? Because hope could be just as terrifying as rejection. What if Nolan regretted writing those words? What if the letter had only been a private way to release emotions that no longer existed? What if confronting him forced both of them into a conversation that neither one could survive unchanged? Every possible answer ended with the same risk: losing Nolan completely. Grant found himself rereading the letter late at night inside hotel rooms, airport lounges, and coffee shops between assignments. He never should have kept reading it, yet he could not stop. Each page reminded him of another memory he had quietly treasured alone. One evening he visited his parents for dinner. His mother watched him push vegetables around his plate before finally asking whether he and Nolan had argued. Grant shook his head. No, she smiled gently. That sounds worse. He looked down at his untouched dinner and laughed without humor. She had known Nolan almost as long as he had. She reached across the table, squeezed his wrist, and spoke so softly he almost missed it. Some people spend their whole lives hoping to find someone who already feels the way they do. Grant drove home thinking about that sentence until well after midnight. By the following Friday, the annual cabin trip stood only hours away. He packed his cameras, spare batteries, hiking boots, and rain jacket with practiced routine. Then, after a long hesitation, he slipped the folded letter into the inside pocket of his backpack. If silence had protected them before, it was no longer protecting either of them now. The drive to the cabin began before sunrise beneath a pale gray sky that promised rain before noon. Nolan arrived first, leaning against his truck with a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. When Grant pulled into the gravel lot a few minutes later, neither of them waved the way they usually did. They simply exchanged quiet nods that felt painfully formal after nearly 10 years of effortless friendship. They loaded camera gear, hiking packs, and food into the trucks with practiced efficiency, speaking only when necessary. Did you bring the trail map? Nolan asked. It is in the side pocket. Extra batteries? Packed. Every answer sounded complete while leaving everything important unsaid. The state park welcomed them with towering pines painted in early autumn colors. Leaves drifted across the narrow road like slow-moving confetti, and cool air carried the earthy scent of damp soil and cedar. Under different circumstances, they would have stopped 3 or 4 times before reaching the cabin, because Grant could never resist photographing morning light filtering through the trees. This time he barely slowed down. Even his camera remained tucked inside its case. By early afternoon, thick clouds swallowed the sun. The first raindrops landed quietly against the windshield before growing into a steady curtain that blurred the mountain road ahead. Nolan tightened both hands around the steering wheel while Grant watched the forest disappear behind silver sheets of rain. Looks heavier than the forecast, Nolan finally said. Grant glanced toward the darkening sky. It is moving fast. 10 minutes later, the rain became a downpour. Wind pushed branches across the road, forcing both trucks to slow almost to a crawl. By the time they reached the old rental cabin, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the ridge, deep enough to rattle the window glass. They hurried inside, carrying bags over their heads, laughing for the first time in weeks when a sudden gust soaked both of them anyway. The laughter faded almost immediately, replaced by another uneasy silence. The cabin looked exactly as they remembered from previous trips. One stone fireplace, 2 worn leather chairs, a wooden dining table covered with tiny scratches left by countless visitors. Rain drummed steadily against the roof while the surrounding forest disappeared into mist. Nolan unpacked groceries while Grant stacked firewood beside the hearth. They moved around each other with the quiet coordination of people who knew each other's routines by heart. Yet every accidental glance ended just as quickly as it began. Late in the afternoon, the lights flickered once before going out completely. The heater stopped humming. The cabin settled into peaceful darkness, broken only by the crackling fireplace Grant managed to light with dry cedar kindling. Warm orange light danced across the walls, softening every shadow inside the room, while rain continued falling beyond the windows. Cell phone service vanished soon afterward. Grant checked his screen and sighed. No signal. Nolan looked toward the storm outside. Looks like we are staying exactly where we are. There were no messages to distract them, no errands waiting back home, no convenient reason to leave early. Just two men, one quiet cabin, and hours of uninterrupted evenings stretching ahead. Grant rested his backpack beside the fireplace and felt the folded letter still waiting inside. Across the room, Nolan stared into the flames as though searching for answers hidden between the glowing embers. Outside, the storm sealed the world beyond the trees. Inside, there was finally nowhere left for either of them to hide. The fire had burned low by the time either of them spoke again. Rain continued tapping against the cabin roof with patient determination, filling every pause between them until the silence itself seemed to breathe. Nolan sat in one of the leather chairs, elbows resting on his knees, watching orange embers collapse into soft gray ash. Across the room, Grant remained standing beside his backpack, his hands buried inside his jacket pockets though he could keep his courage from slipping away. Finally, he crossed the room without saying a word. He reached into the backpack, pulled out several neatly folded pages, and placed them carefully on the coffee table between them. Nolan recognized the paper instantly. His heartbeat stumbled. Neither man touched the letter for several long seconds. Grant broke the silence first. "I read it." The words landed quietly, but they carried the weight of every unanswered question from the past 2 weeks. Nolan closed his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath. "I figured you did." Another pause settled over the room. The fireplace cracked softly behind them. Grant looked down at the folded pages instead of at Nolan. "I should not have opened it." Nolan gave a tired smile that never reached his eyes. "Maybe not." Grant nodded once. "But I cannot pretend I wish I had not." Nolan looked up. Surprise flickered across his face before disappearing behind uncertainty. Grant continued carefully, choosing every word as though one careless sentence could shatter everything they had built together. "I kept reading because every page sounded like something I thought only I had felt." Nolan stared at him without speaking. "There were moments," Grant said quietly, "when I honestly forgot whose words they were." The room felt impossibly still. Outside, wind brushed gently through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Inside, years of silence slowly began to loosen. Nolan laughed once, softly and without humor. "You know what the worst part is?" Grant looked at him. "I almost burned those pages 3 different times." He shook his head. "I always convinced myself it was better to lose the letter than lose you." Grant lowered himself into the chair opposite him. The firelight softened every line across his face. "I thought exactly the same thing." Nolan frowned slightly. Grant smiled, almost embarrassed. "Not about the letter." He looked down at his hands before continuing. "About telling you." Nolan blinked. "I spent years convincing myself you only saw me as your best friend. Every time someone joked about us, I laughed because laughing felt safer than asking if. They might actually be right." Nolan let out a slow breath he had been holding for years. "I wrote that letter because I had nowhere else to put everything I felt." Grant reached toward the folded pages resting between them. His fingertips brushed lightly against the edge of the paper. "I kept hoping the ending would change every time I read it." Nolan looked at him, confused. "The ending never changes." Grant finally met his eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know. I just kept wishing you had written my name years sooner." Nolan shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "I never signed it because I was afraid seeing your name would make it too real." Grant smiled gently. It was always real. Neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other across the small coffee table while the storm slowly drifted farther into the mountains. For the first time since the letter had been discovered, there were no more secrets left between them. Only two hearts quietly admitting they had been walking toward the same destination all along. Morning arrived quietly, as though the mountain itself had decided not to interrupt what had finally begun the night before. The storm had passed, leaving tiny drops of rain clinging to pine branches like scattered pieces of glass catching the first sunlight. Nolan stepped onto the cabin porch, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Cool autumn air brushed against his face, crisp enough to wake every thought that had kept him restless for years. Grant joined him a minute later, camera hanging from one shoulder more out of habit than intention. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. This silence felt different. It no longer carried fear. It simply gave 2 people room to breathe after setting down something impossibly heavy. Grant accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "I almost canceled this trip," he admitted. Nolan looked toward the distant tree line, glowing gold beneath the rising sun. "I almost did too." They both laughed softly, surprised by how easily the sound returned. It felt familiar again. Comfortable. Real. They spent the morning walking the forest trail they had visited every autumn for nearly 6 years. Fallen leaves covered the narrow path in shades of amber and crimson, crunching gently beneath their boots. Grant finally lifted his camera, photographing sunlight slipping through the branches, while Nolan stopped every so often to admire old wooden bridges weathered by countless winters. The ordinary rhythm of their friendship slowly returned, except now every glance lasted a little longer, and every shared smile carried an honesty neither of them had allowed before. At the overlook above the valley, Grant lowered his camera without taking another photograph. "Can I ask you something?" Nolan nodded. "What happens now?" Nolan smiled thoughtfully before answering. "For the first time in years, I do not think we have to pretend we already know." Grant looked relieved by that answer. "Good," he said, "because I have no idea what I am doing." Nolan laughed. "Neither do I." They stood beside the overlook railing, watching clouds drift lazily across distant hills. There was no dramatic promise, no perfect speech waiting to be delivered. Life had never worked that way for either of them. Instead, Nolan turned toward Grant with quiet certainty. "I do know one thing." Grant waited. "I do not want to spend another year wondering what might have happened if we had been honest sooner." Grant's expression softened. "Neither do I." He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded the familiar letter one final time. The paper showed gentle creases from being opened so often over the past weeks. He smoothed it against the wooden railing, read the last sentence once more, then folded it neatly again. "This does not belong hidden inside a box anymore," he said. Nolan watched him slide the letter back into its envelope with surprising care. "Keep it," Nolan whispered. Grant looked up. "Are you sure?" Nolan nodded. "It stopped being only mine the moment you understood it." They started walking back toward the cabin side by side, shoulders brushing lightly now and then without either of them stepping away. Nothing about the future had been planned. There were no guarantees waiting beyond the trees. There was only a quiet decision to stop living inside assumptions and start building something together one ordinary day at a time. Somehow, that felt stronger than any promise either of them could have made. 6 months later, the workshop smelled exactly the way it always had: warm cedar, fresh varnish, and the quiet satisfaction of things carefully restored instead of replaced. Morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor, catching tiny flecks of sawdust that floated through the air like golden dust. Nolan stood beside a dining table he had just finished restoring while Grant adjusted his camera a few feet away, searching for the perfect angle before photographing the completed piece for the workshop website. It had become one of their favorite routines. Grant still traveled for wildlife assignments, sometimes disappearing for days across national parks and mountain ranges. But now every trip ended the same way. Nolan was always waiting, sometimes at the airport, sometimes at the workshop, sometimes with nothing more than 2 cups of coffee and an easy smile that no longer needed to hide behind friendship alone. Their lives had not become extraordinary overnight. If anything, they became wonderfully ordinary. Grocery shopping on Sunday mornings. Long walks after dinner when the weather allowed. Friendly debates over whether old oak aged more beautifully than walnut. Nolan still claimed every piece of furniture deserved a second chance. Grant insisted every photograph deserved natural light. Neither of them ever truly won those arguments, and neither of them seemed interested in trying. One quiet afternoon, Grant returned from a week in the Smoky Mountains carrying a backpack covered with dust and trail stickers. He stepped into the workshop expecting to hear the familiar buzz of power tools, but instead found Nolan sitting at his workbench with a small envelope resting beside him. "You have that look," Grant teased, setting down his camera bag. "The one that usually means you have been building something." Nolan smiled without looking up. "I have." He slid the envelope across the table. "Open it." Grant recognized the careful handwriting immediately. He unfolded the single sheet inside. This letter was much shorter than the first one. It contained only 2 sentences. "I am grateful you found the words I was too afraid to share. Will you stay for every chapter we have not written yet?" Grant read the page twice before smiling to himself. Without saying anything, he reached for the pencil lying beside Nolan's notebook. He turned the page over and wrote a single sentence beneath the last line. "I thought I started answering that question the day I came back to the workshop." He signed his name beneath it, folded the paper once more, and handed it back. Nolan looked at the new handwriting beside his own and laughed softly, the kind of laugh that came from relief instead of uncertainty. He tucked the letter into the same cedar box that had once protected years of silence. This time he left the brass clasp unlocked. Late that afternoon, they carried a newly restored farmhouse table outside for a customer waiting at the curb. Their shoulders brushed naturally as they lifted opposite ends, moving with the quiet rhythm built from years of trust. The setting sun stretched long bands of amber light across the sidewalk, while autumn leaves drifted gently around them. Grant glanced toward Nolan, who caught the look and smiled without needing to ask why. Some stories changed because of grand moments. There's change because 2 ordinary people finally stopped hiding the truth from each other. The letter that once represented fear became something entirely different. It became proof that honesty, even when delayed, could still arrive in time to build a future neither of them had dared imagine alone.